All right, this is the Pro Wrestling Illustrated podcast. I'm your host, PWI senior writer Al Castle, joined by my co-host Brian Solomon. Brian, happy holidays! I've got my
Happy
Ultimate
holidays.
Warrior ugly sweater. You
Oh,
get one of yours?
sorry, I stepped on that. Yes, you do have your Ultimate Warrior ugly sweater. I just have a plain old sweater.
Yes.
Yeah, I really need to invest in some of those. I'm not on the ugly sweater bandwagon as of right now.
Yes, I got a few. I have two of these. My wife, all my Ultimate Warrior, lest everybody think I'm buying myself Ultimate Warrior stuff, it's my wife. But I do appreciate it. And I imagine more is on the way in just a couple days. We are here in the holiday season, the Christmas season. I imagine this is going to be the last episode of the year. So we intend to kind of look back on what I think was a really eventful 2023, also look ahead to 2024, weave in some current events, and there's certainly some big news even here very late in the year with the talk of maybe some negotiations between WWE and Warner Brothers Discovery for a Raw TV deal, which would be just seismic in terms of like the repercussions of that. We'll deal with that all. Plus, part two of my interview with a former PWI writer and editor, Bob Smith. We spoke a long time, so we split it up into two parts. And I actually got to talk to him again this past week for his podcast, which is going to drop soon, called the Outdated Wrestling Podcast. What a great guy. Bob loves you. He can't stop raving about you. And
I know he's on my payroll.
yeah. But I mean, I think there is a common thread among the three of us in terms of like embracing the past. Also, I think embracing the present. I mean, Bob definitely gets that as well. So stay tuned. Let me tell you first about the current issue of Pro Wrestling Illustrated, featuring Tony Storm on the cover, Brian's hot seat interview with, I was putting together with Harry, we always do the top 10 stories of the year. And one of them that I touched on was about kind of like hot breakout acts in 2023. And I think Tony Storm is right near the top, right?
I do. I definitely do. I think it's one of the things that, not to turn everything into a critical thing for AEW, but it's one of the things that they're getting right. And she's a great example. And you know what? I think Roderick Strong is too. She's a great example of somebody who, positioning wise, character wise, actually benefited by leaving WWE and going to AEW. She's in a better place. She's doing great. I mean, from the beginning of when they gave her this thing, she is just a natural. And I'm not just saying that because I got to know her when we did the interview, but she really is. Not everybody could have pulled this off, really, and she is doing it.
But isn't there some irony there that what got her, because she didn't arrive in AEW yesterday, right? I mean, what got her over in AEW was the kind of character work that you typically see in WWE.
Which actually, and that's true. And it's the same. You could say the same for Roderick Strong, because he's totally, that's not, it's almost like AEW can maybe learn more from WWE than they think. Not saying that they just want to turn into WWE, but it doesn't hurt to sometimes lean into some of the more entertainment related aspects of modern pro wrestling.
Yeah. Well, you can read more from Brian's interview with Tony in what is this? The January issue, I think. Might be even later than that, March issue of PWI. Also in here, the 4th annual Tag Team 100 list features on the return of TNA. What else is in here? I know there is a story about the Pan-African Diaspora title finally changing hands.
I have a column on the Von Erichs in there, which is timed for the Iron Claw this month.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Or when have you seen it? I mean, you got one of these advanced screenings. I hope to see it tomorrow.
I would have liked to have seen it tomorrow, but with all the because we're recording this on the 21st, with all the Christmas planning and things that we're doing, it's just, I think, going to be hard to fit in. So I think I have it planned for the day after. I'm going to do it on Boxing Day, December 26th. We're going to finally check it out because my wife wants to come with me on this one. Which
I want to take the whole family to this one too. I mean, they're not that interested, but the Von Erich story has always been like one of these amazing wrestling stories that I've regurgitated a million times over the years. And what's crazy, and I don't want to give any spoilers. I don't think this is a spoiler. This is out there, but the tragedy of the Von Erichs is so great that they couldn't fit it all into this movie, and they actually like eliminated a whole Von Erich death, which
Well, not just a death, Al. They eliminated the whole person, which makes me a little sad. Chris Von Erich just doesn't exist in this version of the Von Erich family.
Far be it for me to judge somebody else's creative process, and I've never written a movie, so I get that you've got condensing one person's life into a movie is a lot. Condensing the story of is it 5? It's 6 brothers, isn't it? I mean, if you count Jackie,
because
who is
Jack Jr. Jack Jr. died as a little boy, so he never, he died in the 50s. So he was like not even. I think he was the oldest one.
And I think they do touch on it, but it is a lot to get into a reasonable sized movie. And I get it speaks to the tragedy of the Von Erichs that it almost becomes like repetitive, right? Like, oh, just another Von Erich killing himself, but that's what happened, and
I think well, because the way that Chris died was very similar to the way that Kerry died, and it's almost like what Kerry did was kind of like a copycat of what Chris did, partly because he was so depressed about what Chris had done, because Chris was like the baby of the group. And I think maybe from a narrative point of view, they just felt like it was too much, it was redundant or too much to handle. But the thing that makes me so sad, and I think the movie looks great, and I have no doubt I'm going to love it, but it almost hurts like the goodwill with wrestling fans when you do something like that. Not that they have to care about wrestling fans. I mean, they're trying to sell this movie to a wide audience, but Chris is such a sad figure because all he ever wanted was to be a Von Erich, and he wasn't physically gifted like the other ones. He was little, he was kind of sickly, and the whole story of his life is that he never quite fit in and he couldn't be one of them. And now they make a movie about the family and they don't even include him in the movie. Like it's like crushing to think about.
Yeah. And again, not to judge, but I'm surprised. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much say Kevin or the remaining Von Erich family had with this story. I mean, I imagine they own the rights to it. But I get it. I've heard the director talk about how because there was some overlap also between Mike and Chris's story that both were kind of a little bit awkward, didn't live up to the reputations of their older brothers, that they kind of consolidated the two stories. But nevertheless, that's the thing with biopics, is that like inevitably, you're not just judging it as a story, you're comparing it to the actual story. I remember doing that with the Freddie Mercury story years ago, which on its own was a really good movie and a really good story, but you can't help but watch and be like, that's not how that happened, or that didn't happen there. Then, and they kind of move things around. And
well,
I don't know. On one hand, it's like I get like trying to tell the best story possible, but also, the idea of even doing a biopic is that this story, the actual story, is supposed to be compelling enough.
Right. And I know we didn't even plan to talk about the Von Erich movie about the Iron Claw, but there's one thing I want to say about that. And I haven't seen the movie yet as of now. Probably, I think maybe by the time this comes out, I may have, but I'm already seeing, people that are with the wrestling fan audience, especially the people that know the Von Erichs and stuff. There's kind of this unrealistic expectation. And it's like, if you want to learn about the Von Erichs or learn about the facts of their story and everything, there's documentaries out there. There's good ones. That's what a documentary is for. That is not what a movie is for. I have people complaining, well, I saw it and I didn't really learn anything new that I didn't know already about the Von Erichs. Well, this movie is not, this is a dramatic, fictionalized film. It's not there to educate you. It's there to entertain you and tell a compelling story. And or people saying, well, this isn't, the Sportatorium didn't look like this, and Michael Hayes didn't wear those kind of trunks and the belt. Like this is not. They're not making this movie for the 400 people who were watching world class wrestling that are still alive in 40 years later. They can't do that. They just have to tell the best story they can tell, as without just outright throwing the truth out the window, obviously. Or just dumping on it or disrespecting it. The Chris Von Erich thing to me comes the closest to doing that, but I haven't seen the movie, so I can't really judge it till I see it.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. Yeah, I mean, it's cool to see pro wrestling on this kind of, the reality is, but for the wrestler and maybe a couple others, that there haven't been a lot of sort of serious wrestling movies.
No.
So I'm glad to see one that maybe it's going to get some Oscar buzz, even. So yeah, looking forward to seeing it. And you mentioned that was in your column in the latest issue of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Pick it up now. PWI-online.com. There's still time. We're here in the holiday season to pick up subscription for the wrestling fan in your life. You can have a digital subscription, a print subscription, a combination now. Either way, you save a lot off of the cover price. Also, over at PWI-online, there's all kinds of gift ideas in terms of back issues. We've got historic issues. We've got merch. We've got all kinds of stuff. So whether for yourself or, again, for the wrestling fan in your life, head on over to PWI-online.com. We're also wrapping up the big year in wrestling issue now. Again, I'm working with Harry on the top 10 stories. We're tallying up votes for the awards. It should be an interesting one. So don't miss any of it. So let's talk a little bit about 2023, Brian. Like with all things, you need sometimes some time, some distance to really appreciate like the historical significance of a year. But it feels like 2023 was pretty significant when you talk about, especially on WWE's end, like those boom periods, right? And again, I don't know that when we were, I guess when we were in 96, 97, you did feel it coming with WWE and the Attitude Era and Steve Austin and all that. But I think it's the first time since then, and it's been kind of slow building, but this really felt like a year where WWE, um, moved into another era, and part of that is technically because of the change in ownership with TKO, and this is not a company owned by the McMahon family anymore, which in and of itself is such an insane story. But also because for the first time in a while, we've had something of competition, the return of competition with AEW now around for 4 years. And it was never neck and neck, but it felt like more of a real race for a while. And this felt in some ways like the year that they pulled away somewhat. And the metrics, that was one of the stories I was writing for the top 10 stories the last day or two, digging into WWE metrics, and they're great. I mean, this was just a super successful year for WWE. Again, part of it I think is the restructuring, and part of it is I think a lot of, and this is what you want out of wrestling, a lot of acts really clicked this year. Whether it was, Roman's been the anchor for a while, and in some ways, there's a little bit of an off year for Roman, especially
Mhm.
after WrestleMania. I don't think he was the force that he was the last couple of years, but Roman was instrumental, I think, in helping getting other guys over, and that's the idea. And you think about guys like Cody Rhodes and LA Knight, Judgment Day. I'm sure I'm forgetting a bunch of people, but a lot of acts really took off. I mean, WWE is here at the end of 2023, a really fun, really exciting product to watch.
Yeah, and this is different from other boom periods, and I think it really does speak to just kind of the organic success. Because if you look at the other two really big periods that the company's had, especially since Vince owned it and everything, the mid '80s, the late '90s, right? There was a drastic change in the product, like almost to unrecognizable levels. Like if you look at WWF in 1983 and in 1985, they're like two totally different companies. And if you look at WWE in 1996 and 1998, two totally different companies. I feel like there hasn't been that kind of seismic change if you're just watching the show. Like the WWF of 10 years ago, appearance wise, production wise, tone wise, is not dramatically different from the WWE of today. I think it's just a case of things are working now. It's like they haven't they've remade the company from behind the scenes point of view, but they haven't totally rebuilt the product from the ground up. It's just that now they have some acts and storylines and things that are connecting and clicking, whereas maybe in past years they didn't as much. So it's a much simpler road to success. Although I think as part of that, I wouldn't say that this period right now, it's not as hot as either of those last two periods were, for that reason, that it's still, recognizably the WWE of some years ago. But there's no doubt that they're clicking right now. They have a product that people want to see. It's becoming harder and harder for the people that love to criticize them because of all those kind of things. And also want to say too, as far as like bringing up new acts and things, that is so crucial and key. Like, I don't think that shouldn't be the only thing you try to do. I mean, sometimes a champion's got to win all the time, like we see with Roman Reigns, or a top face has to win all the time. But they are always on the lookout, and I think that might be a Paul Levesque thing, for making sure you have people coming up from behind to take the place. Like right now, and I never thought you'd see this. Judgment Day is great, and they always have been great from the beginning. But I think they're I don't even think this is an opinion. I think they're a hotter act right now than the Bloodline.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And a line in one of my top 10 stories dealt with that, and I was mentioning the Judgment Day, and I wanted to call him the hottest faction of 2023, but I sort of took a pause. I'm like, well, would this be okay to say? And I thought, yeah, yeah. I mean, like, certainly for the second half of 2023, and even more than that. I mean, really, post WrestleMania, Bloodline, and that's kind of storyline driven, fell apart. And I'm not even saying it was a bad thing, because ultimately it might have been the best thing for Jey Uso, another act that emerged in 2023 as a top guy. WWE's got like a lot of top talent that wasn't there, or wasn't, even if they were there, they weren't in the positions that they're at now, even a year or two ago. So yeah, I mean,
Gunther's another great example.
Gunther, absolutely, yeah. I mean, setting the Intercontinental title record this year. I just got a new pair of glasses, and I feel like my vision is basically fine, or I thought it was. But then you put on the glasses, and you're like, oh, like it could be so much better. And I feel like that's sort of been the difference with WWE. You touched on it. It hasn't been some huge transformation. Like the kind of thing we'd see in like when Vince Russo went over to WCW, where it was a total reboot or anything like that. They haven't done that at all. It's just kind of bringing everything into focus a little bit, getting rid of some of the bad habits, focusing on what works. And it just makes it's not that Raw or SmackDown any given week is like this incredible must-see television, but it's just it's watchable. It's entertaining. Yeah. I mean, it's a pleasure to watch. Dom Mysterio has been fantastic. The Rey Mysterio has been a lot of fun. Randy Orton comes back with some energy and some momentum. Drew McIntyre is doing great work. You think about early in the year how hot Sami Zayn was. That's obviously cooled down. The Zayn Owens act, and the main event of night one of WrestleMania. And I could go on and on and on. There are so many terrific acts in WWE, and not a whole lot of bad ones, right? I mean, I think that's even like acts that historically, like a Miz. Even Miz is doing good work. It feels like everybody's kind of bringing their A game.
He has been, yeah. The stuff he's been doing with Gunther. I mean, people are not that matches are very important too, and he's been having some of the best matches of his career with Gunther. I think it's safe to say, and it's like I always say this, and this is bearing it out too. If you have a solid amount of really over acts and stories, like a few really good ones, it carries everything else. Not everybody needs to be doing remarkable work. You know what I mean? Like a lot of it is the high tide carries all boats, or whatever, however that goes. And that's what's happening right now in WWE. They have enough really solid things going on, different things that it makes the entire company look good, and makes the product look good, and makes people want to watch it.
Yeah. What do you think the ceiling is here? I mean, when you think about those boom periods in the 80s and in the 90s, like there was this clear trajectory where it was growing. You felt like there was this momentum. Does it feel like we're still kind of on the low end of this wave that is cresting up? Does it feel like it's sort of plateaued? How much space is there for this era to compete with the Attitude Era or the Rock and Wrestling Era?
Right. The difference is it's as people have said many times, it's a very different media landscape now. It's a different entertainment landscape. And like, for example, in the 80s when Vince did what he did with the expansion and rock and wrestling and Hulkamania, like at that time, you know, the wrestling business was wide open potential wise. It was just waiting for a Vince McMahon to step in and do what he did, quite frankly. And even the entertainment business was much more TV broadcasting, much more regionalized. There wasn't as much there was a lot of local stuff and things that don't exist anymore. So I feel like you can't really expect or have that same type of boom period because, like you said, there is a ceiling, there is a limit to how far you can go. Same thing in the Attitude Era, but I think more like what happened in the Attitude Era. I think the future right now for the company, and it's happening really, is not so much that they're going to expand into media wise something bigger, but that they're going or they can move further into the consciousness of popular culture than they are, because that is something where they definitely can go further. There's nobody as hot as they are right now, not even Roman Reigns in WWE, who is as much of a crossover star as Austin was, or The Rock was, or
even I
Hogan
think John
was,
Cena,
or
right? I
even
mean,
John Cena.
yeah,
So that is kind of the frontier for them, is getting more like cultural cachet and becoming more mainstream in the public eye. I think being in the company they're in now is a step forward for that, because, you know, there's going to be all this, as they call it in the corporate world, synergy and leveraging and all that junk, where they really try to get their brands out in front of the public and make them as mainstream as possible. I think that's going to be one of the biggest advantages of this merger and things. But that's really where the future lies in terms of like growing this boom period, I think.
yeah, yeah. I just remembered Solo Sokoa is another name that really took off and became an important
Absolutely.
player in 2023. And it's crazy that the last Raw of 2023 is headlined by the Creed brothers, you know. So it shows that like they're really, you know, getting behind some different acts. As far as 2024 and that trajectory and what the ceiling could be, there is every reason to believe, even though there was every reason to believe this year that it will be Cody Rhodes' year, right? That Cody finishes the story, and they finally, you know, go with him as the guy, and different than Roman Reigns, who has carried this company essentially as a heel in the last several years. This will be the first strong babyface leader of the company, at least since John Cena. I mean, they tried it with Roman, and it was a colossal failure. He did not work as the top babyface. But what could a WWE led by Cody Rhodes look like? You know, and I was thinking the same thing in terms of like that crossover appeal. I mean, is he the kind of guy who shows up on Jimmy Fallon and the Today Show, and I mean, some of that doesn't even mean what it used to, because they're all kind of in bed together.
Or the equivalent of that. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I think honestly, I think he's tailor made for that, which is why I've been hoping that they pull the trigger for so long. He really is the perfect kind of good guy hero, face of the company that you want to have, especially if that's the route you're trying to take. I mean, you can't ask for anything better, you know, as at least as far as what they have right now. He's the guy. I mean, he's a throwback in some ways. It's like you could see the full circle after the Attitude Era, which is that he's much more of like what you call a white meat baby face. He's not one of these like Austin types or like edgy, you know, he's a pure good guy, kissing babies, the whole 9 yards. Nothing wrong with that. It's almost like in 2023, that's like a change of pace, you know, from what you're used to seeing in wrestling. I think it's a great thing. He's a great ambassador. You're going to have more of the hardcore fans that hate that because they want everything to be ECW. You know what I mean? But I think he's the guy. I just hope they haven't done harm, you know, by waiting so long, like we've talked about before. But if that's the way you want to go, and you want to replicate like the superstar babyface world champion that carries the company right now, he's your guy.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. They've got another guy, obviously late in the year now with CM Punk joining the company, returning to the company, and he steps into the company right there with Cody and
Mhm.
Roman's as the top guy. I think already ahead of Seth Rollins, already ahead of so many of the top stars in the company. Um, Looking ahead to 2020, and we could also, I guess, sort of evaluate how he's been doing the last few weeks since returning. But how are you feeling about CM Punk and what could be in store for him in 2024? I mean, when you talk about Cody, and one thing that I expect in 2024 is Roman to be, and it's already happened here, but to be less of a presence and less of the focal point of the company. WWE maybe kind of turning the page, and that means for the last several years, when you talked about big matches, dream matches, Roman was always part of those, right? It was Roman versus, insert wrestler here. I think they're moving away from that. Not that Roman won't be in the mix next year, but I think it's going to be, you got to kind of think up a new crop of big matches, headline matches, to headline the stadium shows, all that stuff. Um, how does that, how much of is Cody a part of that? How much is Punk a part of that? How much is of them together is part of that?
I think that's a good thing too. I mean, like we had said, the Roman thing has been getting old lately. It's almost like we're almost beyond the point of saying it's starting to get old. I think it was starting to get old
Yeah.
at WrestleMania. So now we're what is it? Gosh, it's almost 3.5 years. He's actually on the verge. If he makes it to the end of January, which I'm sure he will surpass the length of Bruno Sammartino's second world title reign, not the first, but the second one, which is the shorter one, which is like there was once a time where even the thought of someone getting close to anything like that would be unthinkable. But
Remember when
apparently,
JBL made like
right,
11 months or something, and it was like a big deal.
right. In fact, when JBL made 11 months, I think at that point, he had been the longest reigning heel world champion that they ever had because he surpassed Yokozuna and I think superstar Billy Graham. One of those two guys had the record. I mean, that's like ridiculous now to think about. But no, it's good that they have a landscape like this. I think the stuff with Punk, again, like I said last time, it's like textbook. It's almost like they're intentionally trying to say, you see, AEW, this is how you actually do it. This is how you create the drama and the tension and make money and do business without losing control of your talent and having them legitimately go into business for themselves. And it's wild to me, not that I have to feel like I'm smarter than everyone else, because I'm clearly not, but it's wild to me how easily people get taken in by some of these things. Like, smart people on the internet or on it's like, oh, Dominic Mysterio, he went into business for himself with that tweet about CM Punk, and oh my god, I think he's starting the same kind of locker room drama. He's not going to last long in WWE. And I'm just like, how are you, do you really think that's what's happening? Like, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
CM Punk on Twitter, he posted, I've been waiting to punch this kid in the face since he was little or something like that. And then Dominic came back and posted, a little gif of one of CM Punk's worst botches from AEW, like swinging and falling on his face. And he wrote something like, "Please punch me like this," and it's like,
Right.
enough about WWE. These
Yeah.
things do not go on there. They go on in AEW. So if that's all you know, then you think, oh, well, it's happening all over again. But that is not. This is a much tighter ship, and I guarantee you that CM Punk, the Mysterio family, they all love each other. They've all known each other for many years. I've been around them. And I'm sure that these are things that are all like, hey, guys, wouldn't it be awesome? You do this, right? And then I do that. Oh, my God. Yeah, that'll be great. Let's do that. This is the way it's actually done. And anytime you have a situation in WWE where there's real drama, it gets locked down really, really quick. And it very rarely, if ever, gets to the point where it's even facing the public at all. So, again, this is like the way to do it right with CM Punk, to play off his history and his drama, but in a way that is controlled and part of the show.
Yeah. I really enjoyed everything out of CM Punk so far. We're only a couple
Yes.
weeks in, but I think it's hit the right note. I think,
And
you
can I say
know,
something about that
sure.
before you go on? I'll because before I forget, but I remember when we first talked about CM Punk 2 years ago when he came to AEW. And it felt like, you remember this, right? I mean, we talked about this. When he came in, it was huge, huge, maybe even more huge than this. I mean, it was big because
He was
he'd been
gone
gone.
for 8
He'd
years.
been
Yeah.
gone for so long. But then very quickly, the two of us were just like, well, what is he going to do? What's happening? He just shows up every week. Like, what? They put him against people that he's not going to lose. There doesn't seem to be a direction. The first time there was anything compelling was, to my mind, with him was the Eddie Kingston thing, where it just felt like, oh, wow, okay, he might not win this. Whereas with this, it feels like they know exactly what they're doing right from the beginning. It's not just, we got CM Punk. Okay, what do we do now? This is a sense of like, we know exactly what to do.
Yeah, and it feels big league. It's the right person in the right setting. To throw out another analogy, I was just watching the other day. Paul Stanley from Kiss, like briefly, like created like this a couple years ago during COVID, like a solo like soul music kind of act, and he's got like a band with trumpets behind him. I mean, it just like God bless him if it's something that he wanted to pursue, but it felt a little. I don't know. I don't want to be insulting. If you liked it, you liked it. It didn't feel like Paul Stanley. Then you see Paul Stanley with the makeup at Madison Square Garden with fire behind him, and 30,000 screaming fans or whatever it is, and the biggest rock star in the world. And it's like, yeah, that's the right setting, and it feels that way sort of for Punk too. It feels like. It's corny. It's what he said, but it feels like he's home now, and yeah, I'm excited. And I really don't have a lot of qualms about some kind of big blow up. It doesn't even feel. Could it happen? Sure. I mean, he's like a volatile personality, but I don't have a sense that it's imminent or anything like that. Do you assume he wins the Royal Rumble? I think he does.
I think so, and I know it's one of those classic things of, we talk about how predictable the Rumble gets sometimes, most of the time,
Yeah.
where it's sort of like, well, we need to get this guy to this position.
It's two people. That's the thing about having two belts, though, is that
right.
it could be two guys. So it's either Cody or it's Punk, and I meant that probably that's the last two guys in the ring.
Right, and now you have, like you said, you have the two world titles, so that even if you don't win the Rumble, you can still challenge for the other one, So you could conceivably see Seth and CM Punk, and then again Reigns and Rhodes potentially, like that could still happen. So yeah, I mean, but I've said this many times and I stand by it. Sometimes the most obvious thing is the right thing. Sometimes you give the people what they want. It doesn't always have to be a surprise or a twist or a swerve. I think that's very Attitude Era kind of thinking. Like, people want to feel good. And too often WWE has been guilty of not doing that, of saying, nope, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do the thing you want to see.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with, even if you see the car coming from a mile away, of you know what I mean? Of letting it happen rather than just trying to be super clever.
Yeah. When you again looking ahead to 2024 and thinking about like marquee matches, we know we're getting Seth and Punk. We know we're getting Cody and Roman at some point. What are some other matches that pop up? I think Damon Priest is in the mix somewhere, right? He still has that briefcase. I could see him be a big player in 2024. LA Knight still in the mix. Do we see him win a world title in 2024? I would think. Well, once that belt is off of Roman, anything goes, right? I mean, you could put it on Cody and then have Cody drop it to LA Knight some months later. So there's a lot more intrigue in some ways once that belt's off of Roman, because again, as long as it's been on Roman, it really feels like it's going to take something so huge to get it off of him.
Right.
It feels like Cody is that thing. But who knows? Are we here next year talking about Roman, approaching 5 years with the world title?
Well, Sam Roberts put out this thing, and he just like broke the internet a couple of days ago on his podcast, where he was just like, the whole theory of his episode was, look, Roman is not losing to anyone, like to anyone on the horizon, nobody. And he broke down everybody: Punk, Cody Rhodes, LA Knight. He was like, Randy Orton, he's not losing to anyone, like to any time soon. Like, this was his theory. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. I really don't, especially now that they have the other world title. But I think another person in 2024 that I'm really hoping, and I keep harping on it, but he's one of my favorite guys, is Gunther, because I feel like there is not that I don't think he's like face of the company kind of guy, but not everybody needs to be. But he's almost to me like the next Brock Lesnar. And there's so much potential. They have built up so much like potential energy in him as this unstoppable mid-card champion, but he is a mid-card champion that it's like I feel like he's waiting to be unleashed on the main event picture. Like I think fans would be hungry for that. The idea of I am the most dominant intercontinental champion of all time. I've beaten everybody. Like no one even gets close to beating me. And now I want to be the world champion. Like that's a holy S moment. Like him confronting one of the world champions, right? Possibly
what's
Roman.
the move? I mean, like I don't know. You could go on from it. You could do Roman, you could do Seth, you could do Punk, you could do Cody. I think Cody maybe because Cody is that white meat baby face. Maybe that's the best combination. You know, you put the title on Cody and Gunther's the one to dethrone him some months later.
That would be the most satisfying scenario for the world title with him, because I think that was a natural thing coming out of last year's Rumble. And I think a lot of people, including me, thought that was the direction, because those two guys were the last two in there, and Gunther had lasted the whole time and all this, that Cody was going to win the title at Mania, and then Gunther was going to be waiting in the wings like, hello, remember me? I think that is a natural. I also think even outside the world title, I mentioned Brock Lesnar, but him and Brock Lesnar would be immense, because they've created something special in him. Like the fans really believe in him. Like he is like a force of nature at this point.
And I can see that at Mania.
Yeah, you could put him in there with anybody that's really big, and they would buy it at this point.
Yeah. Maybe that's the first step is and that was a match people wanted to see last year, Brock and Gunther at WrestleMania, and maybe that's the next step to really push him as a top guy. Let's spend a little time here talking about the women, and we haven't talked about them as much in WWE, and really when you talk about WWE and women in 2023, it's one woman, and that's Rhea Ripley, and there's such a gulf between her and whoever is next. It's even hard now to kind of think like, what is that dream match at WrestleMania? Is it Becky? Is it Bianca? I think both have cooled off a good bit, and that's the thing. Because I was writing something about Rhea for the top 10 stories, and as hot as she's been and as dominant as she's been, she hasn't had since winning the title a lot of marquee matches or any. I mean, she's just sort of been like, and that not that that's a bad thing. She's just been kind of knocking down challengers, whether it's Raquel or Natty or whoever. But it certainly going into WrestleMania and even beyond, then it's like it does feel like you need something. She feels like for sure capable of headlining a pay-per-view. Right, but she needs the opponent, and she's got one fewer now with Charlotte sidelined for a while. But Bianca feels like a hot, fresh match that they haven't done. They'd have to kind of heat her back up, and Becky feels like a special match.
Yeah, she's an interesting case. She's the kind of a case that sometimes can illustrate the glass ceiling of women's wrestling that still exists, in the sense that, to me now, she's in that rarefied air of some of those women. China immediately comes to mind immediately, but there's others who get bigger than the women's division. Like they transcend it. Wendy Richter was that for like about 10 minutes, where they're bigger than women's wrestling to the point where it's almost irrelevant who they wrestle, who they face. Like Rhea Ripley's one of the biggest stars in WWE, one of the most over acts, male or female. I think Charlotte has been in that type of a position before, Charlotte Flair, but not to the extent that Rhea is right now. I don't think. Maybe she has. But then it becomes that question, like you said, of, okay, well, then what do they actually do? Because the reality, and I'm not just saying this is my opinion or how I think it should be, but as hot or as big as women's wrestling has gotten in the last 10 years in the United States, it's still secondary to the men's wrestling in fans' eyes. It's still a secondary part of the show. It's no longer like a sideshow like it used to be, or like some weird added attraction. Thank goodness. It's much bigger now. It's a much more important part of the show, but it's not a 50-50 equal thing in terms of the presentation. So then when you get somebody like a Rhea Ripley, you almost feel like, how far can she go? There's only so far, and that's why I think they're smart in a way to not lean too heavily in with her in the matches and the opponents and make it so much about the opponents. Like, other people, I think, have said this, and sometimes they miss the point of just like, well, she's been a very forgettable women's champion. And it's like, by what metric? I mean, like,
Yeah.
maybe if this was, a real sport or something, but it's not. She's been an immense success, the biggest women's success story of 2023 to me. So I mean, I think they're doing what they're doing with her for that reason. There's only so far sometimes that a woman can go in a major wrestling company just by competing for the women's title. Like, there's a limit to that. You have to be bigger than that to really make a mark.
And I think that's one of the one of the things that, and I don't know how much of this was by design or sort of like a happy accident, but one of the things that I think has made her such a hot act and a featured star is being in Judgment Day. So she gets TV time alongside the men. So it's they've always had sort of like, all right, this will be the women's segment, right? And realistically, it's always relegated to a certain part of the show. She's opening Raw, on any given week, or or headlining Raw, whether in a match or not. She's part of the most visible featured segments and angles because she's mixing it up with the top guys in the company. I think that's and has held her own. She's such a blast to watch. One thing, looking ahead to 2024 with the women, maybe kind of an X factor thrown in there. Sasha Banks, right? Is there? I don't know how much people are seriously talking about it. I think she's coming back in 2024, or maybe even earlier. I mean, she's already been teasing her comeback. So it should happen. There's a question of where she comes back, and we've had these conversations about what's the best fit for people. Whether it was Will Ospreay or some others, Nick Aldis, we talked about Sasha Banks, and I'd like to see her back in WWE. I think sort of like what we saw with Cody. I think taking this time away, she comes back as a much bigger star, right? I mean, if she comes back and to a at the Rumble or in a face off with Rhea or something like that, I mean, the place goes nuts, and she instantly is a top act. Versus, you can go to AEW and you could have the 5-star match with insert or Stardom or something like that. It's like, I get her. Part of it's still motivated by the art, the craft, but she's still young. I don't think she's 30 yet. And I think there's a lot for her to do in WWE.
And I think that she seems to have made that realization, which is why we just have recently seen the story of how, there were maybe plans for her to go into AEW, and that kind of evaporated, because I think that's coming from her. It's certainly not coming from them. They're not going to be like, you know what? We don't really want you. Like, that's something I don't think Tony Khan has ever said to anyone, really. But I think it's more her saying, okay, I got this out of my system. I did this thing. I went to New Japan. I won the title there. I'm doing indie stuff, and it's just not the same. And I think sometimes people come to that realization. I think Trinity even has that realization, but she's doing what she's doing right now, and I think she's going to kind of like see that through. But I think a lot of time people come to that realization of nothing is quite like that. And so I think then it makes them miss the place and makes them want to come back, especially if they were in a position where they were doing well there. And they think like, well, maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought it was, like that kind of thing. And also in the modern age, that's how people get freshened up. Used to be you go to different territories.
That's Cody, that's Punk, that's
right.
So many guys. Yeah.
Now that's what you do. You leave for a while. How can we miss you if you don't leave? Right. The old adage. They leave, they come back, and they're hot.
Yeah. I hope we see that. Last thing on WWE, and this is maybe a good transition to AEW. The rumors of a WBD, I don't know, deal, but at least negotiations. That those conversations are happening. Once unthinkable, and it sounds like there's really something there. First, I mean, there's so many parts of this. First, the notion that USA wouldn't keep Raw is kind of nuts. But they're getting back SmackDown. There's all kind of these moving pieces. NXT moving to CW, but Raw potentially on TNT or TBS. It's unthinkable. The home of not just AEW but of WCW. It'd be kind of crazy. Do you see that potentially as a good move for WWE in that WBD now in WB Warner Brothers Discovery alone is such a huge property, and now discussions of potentially a merger with Paramount makes it even bigger. And WWE in that mix would be just huge, and I would think devastating for AEW.
It would be not necessarily a death knell because the money is limitless from the Khan family, but definitely the end of AEW as a major player on the stage. What I think though is this is, well, first of all, it's happened before, which I love pointing out, because this is, if it happened, it would be like the second Black Saturday 40 years later, because
Right.
for people that remember or don't, 40 years ago, Vince McMahon took over the TBS time slot on Saturday nights, the famous 6:05, kicked Georgia Championship Wrestling off, World Championship Wrestling off, and put WWF on there. That was a total disaster, and they wound up selling the time slot to Crockett, and the rest is history. But history could definitely repeat itself. They're not above doing this. I know Vince McMahon isn't in charge anymore, but I have to say, and I'm so careful now because I put my foot in my mouth with the Punk thing, but I'm not the greatest predictor. But the way I see it playing out is I don't see that happening. I think that this is all kind of leveraging to try to get the best deal. I think a more likely scenario might be that USA Network decides to pony up the money and decides to keep Raw. Like I'd be less surprised if that happened. The problem is money, right? Because like you said, USA Network is now getting SmackDown, which for some people, a lot of people view that now as the A show because of Roman Reigns and the bloodline and everything. And it gets higher ratings being on Fox. It's not going to anymore when it goes to USA Network. That's going to change because there's some people still, even in this day and age, who just plop in front of the TV and watch what's ever on network television. There is a certain element of that. It's easier to find. But I don't think that the key is that Warner Brothers Discovery has to be willing to pay that money that WWE is looking for Raw. And when I see people that say, well, Punk is the difference maker, it's because he's there now. I understand that, and I do think that's a needle mover. I do think it gets your foot in the door. It's what got the meeting made, I think. The fact that, hey, look at what we got going on now. This guy that you loved, because we know that they loved him. They loved Punk in AEW.
Right.
Like the Warner Brothers Discovery was pushing for them to keep him there.
Yeah.
Right. They loved him there. But I don't know if any one person is enough for them to say, you know what? Yes, we'll pay the $40 zillion that you're asking for because of this one guy. Like that seems a little far-fetched to me. I could once again put my foot in my mouth. We'll see. If that does happen, I don't know what's going to happen to AEW particularly, because WWE always had that clause of if you're carrying our show, there can't be any other wrestling on your platform. I think even with the change in leadership, even without Vince there, I still think that something like that would be in effect. So I don't think AEW would remain on the networks if that happened. And they might follow a trajectory like what happened with Impact, where, they're on Spike, right? And then they wind up on the Shoe Network or whatever the hell. Like that kind of thing is not out of the realm of possibility, especially with a product that's not hot right now. Ticket sales dwindling, ratings dwindling. They're not going to have a lot of leverage. Like if they get dumped, they're not going to be able to go around and say, hey, we're the hot commodity. You want to pick us up? They don't have that happening right now. So they're vulnerable.
Yeah. And that's what makes this a little more believable, right? So if you believe that Warner Brothers Discovery has been sort of like pleasantly surprised with the popularity of wrestling on their channels, right? And they seem to have given it the college try, right? I mean, they went from Dynamite to Rampage, expanded over to Collision earlier this year. So they seem to be up for doing wrestling again, and they've got this long legacy of wrestling with Ted Turner going back, so long. But at the same time that like you're investing in AEW, you see some of the numbers dwindling, and Tony Khan AEW is going to spin it in the most positive, and not that they're dying by any means, but it
No.
doesn't feel like a super hot product. But they're relatively healthy, but so on one side, you've got AEW with these buildings that are largely empty and some viewership numbers that are certainly disappointing, especially for Rampage. And on the other hand, as we've been talking about, a red hot WWE product, right? That by any measure is doing really, really well. I mean, year over year, you compare all the numbers, TV, live attendance, merch, all of it. It's a super successful product, and now even more so with the TKO merger. If you're Warner Brothers, I mean, it's like, well, if we're going to be in wrestling, let's go all in. Let's be with the top wrestling company. Why do we want number two when we can have
Right.
number one? Now, granted, number one might cost you a lot more.
Right. And not having been in the room when it happened, I think it's safe to say, though, that that probably was the whole thesis of the meeting that was held, because we know that Levesque and Nick Khan, and I think there was a TKO executive. I forget who it was. I don't think it was the Endeavor CEO. I can't remember his name, but Ari Emanuel. But I mean, there were important people in there with WBD people for hours. Apparently the meeting went on for a couple of hours. So it was like a serious meeting. And you can totally imagine that being the discussion. Like, look, we know you guys have AEW on your network and you've had some success with them. And we would like to, we are the big leagues. We are the real deal. And we want to show you why we are. You do business with us, it's on a whole other level. You've had some success here. We are the industry leader. Do you want to be in business with the industry leader? Like, that's a very easy hook, to hang your meeting on, that kind of an idea. And then it just comes down to money. Do you want to pay the money? WWE, I do think if a deal would be made, WWE would have to meet them at a certain point. They would have to probably bring it down if you really want a sweetheart deal like that, and to have the, I'm sure, satisfaction, and that would be part of it. Let's not fool ourselves, of booting AEW off the networks. If you want that, you may have to take slightly less than what you were asking for, and I think that they would.
Yeah, I'm surprised, and I know there's still time, but I would have expected USA, NBC Universal to make a stronger play here, because Raw has been synonymous with USA and that brand for so long. And what is USA without Monday Night Raw? I mean, it's
but they'll have SmackDown
reruns.
They'll,
Yeah, that's fine, but or you could have both, and they've already gotten rid of NXT, which wasn't setting the world on fire, but I imagine is doing better than most of their shows, and I don't think would have cost as much for them to keep. So you sense like something of kind of like a cavalier attitude, and NBC Universal's got so much to offer, and that's part of what came with getting SmackDown. There's like 4 NBC I guess quarterly specials on their Saturday Night's Main Event or what have you, but WWE is such an important part of that company. I think they take it for granted sometimes, but how many Peacock subscribers are just WWE fans? I bet you it's a good chunk, right? Because these are people who are otherwise paying $70 for a pay-per-view. Now you pony up number $5-10, you get it. So again, and it's still early. They could still make a play here, but if NBC Universal doesn't fight hard to keep WWE, I think they'll regret it. So we'll see. Let's talk a little bit more about AEW, and just sort of a weird year. On one hand, it's like the largest paid live attendance in the history of wrestling, Wembley Stadium, 80,000, all that stuff, and there's a lot of stuff to point to that was really great this year. I think this is the year that MJF really came into his own as a top guy, and one of these players who's truly versatile, can do it all, now really thriving as a babyface. So a lot to like. They got Will Ospreay. They've had some other big signings, but here in the end of 2023, like we've been talking about, it doesn't feel like a red hot product. And I don't know. I think there's 2023 was also the year that sort of like the I don't know what the and the metaphor is, analogy is, the bloom is off the rose with Tony Khan, right? I mean, I think there's been like kind of a loss of confidence in him being like the greatest booker in the world in this year. So what is the state of AEW? What are the prospects of turning things around in 2024, or do they even need to be turned around because they're not so bad?
They could just settle into, people have said this is a different version of the company than what they started as. And we've even seen some people leaving because of that. I think that's why Cody left. That's why Punk didn't work out. That's why we see somebody like QT Marshall, who, was not a major factor on the TV product, but behind the scenes was an important figure. People like that saying, this isn't the same company.
Yeah,
The
you hear Britt
creative
Baker.
differences, right?
Yeah, I
People
mean,
wanting to get out. And maybe they lean into that. Maybe, it seems like they want to be the American New Japan, something like that,
mhm.
like the American version of a Japanese wrestling promotion. And if that's what maybe that's where they see their identity. It's almost like they're saying, well, we can't become WWE. We can't play on an even playing field with them. We can corner this part of the market. We can cater to the people that want to see Ring of Honor, that want to see New Japan, that hate WWE, that hate this sports entertainment style of things. And that'll be our thing. And you're never going to be the industry leader doing that. You're just not. But maybe you're happy with your piece of the pie. And it seems almost like they are. That's just what they want to be.
Yeah, right. And I guess the question is, you know, there's right sizing that, right? I mean, if you're going to be that company, is that a company that is on prime time on
Right.
TNT and TBS every week? I mean, what you're just, you know, New Japan's on TV every week, and I don't know how many people watch it. The point is that like that is a much more niche product
Yes.
than what the hope was for AEW. And it was. I mean, the thought was that it was going to be the big two, sort of like we had with WWE and WCW for all those years. Right. I mean, it feels like AEW is sort of contracting. And again, there's something of a contradiction when you see Wembley Stadium and some other metrics they've had, and they do really well on pay-per-view. I mean, they're still selling often, I think more than 100,000 pay-per-views. Who's doing that? So
Right.
by no means are they like, dead and buried or anything like that. But also, I don't know. It feels like with AEW, and this is part of like Tony's kind of fault with all like the big announcements all the time, but we're sort of always waiting on like the next big thing, and I don't see it.
Right, right. But also then too, when you learn, as we have learned now, that they are losing money, that's concerning. I mean, you still want to make money, even you want to be in the black, like whatever you're doing. You know, at the end of the day, the revenue is not as important. This is like economics 101 as the profit. And yeah, the revenue is growing, which is weird because then it makes you think of God, what the cost must be. Holy cow, to be doing
Yeah.
what they're doing,
Well, look
because
at the
they're
roster.
because they're
It's
showing how
huge.
the revenue is growing like year
Yeah.
over year. It has been, and yet they're losing money. Like WWE, I think had one, maybe two money losing years the entire time that Vince McMahon has been running the company, and probably ever, even in their worst years. So I mean, like that's a concerning thing when your company is just bleeding money. Even if you want to be a niche product, you want to be a niche product that is profitable so you can keep operating, because yes, the cons are never going to run out of money, so it's not going to be like a bankruptcy. That's never going to happen.
Right.
But there could be a time where they just say this isn't worth it anymore, like this is just a loss leader. Why are we still doing this? Like that could happen at some point.
And it's sort of and again, I don't know their economics that well. I'm not going through their ledgers, but certainly you look at that product and it looks like a company where the spending has gone crazy.
Mhm.
A gigantic bloated roster, where they would seemingly, there's not anybody that they won't bring in and pay a healthy salary to. Half these guys aren't even, Jeff Hardy. When's the last time, like, Jeff Hardy was even discussed as like a major act? And they have so many guys like that all over the place, that you know if each of these guys are making well into the six figures or more, and in a lot of these cases seven figures, like where's that coming from? Who's paying all this? 3 TV shows each week. It just feels like they need to be right sized. That there is a place for AEW, but maybe they've gotten too big for the britches, so to speak. Um, and anything else come to mind in terms of what were lasting memories of 2023 WWE, AEW, elsewhere?
Boy, I don't know. I mean, I think we touched on so many big ones there. The Cody Rhodes phenomenon and the CM Punk coming back to WWE were huge. The emergence of LA Knight, I thought, was a big deal in the company, like creating a truly new main event star. I mean, yes, I know he was Eli Drake. I know he was Impact World Champion. I get it. But from a WWE point of view and perspective, a brand new main eventer, that these are all good things. It's a healthy time, I think, for the industry overall. Even just the fact that there is a struggling number 2 promotion on major cable TV is something that we never had before the last, 3 or 4 years. So it's a good time to be a wrestling fan.
Yeah, we're getting TNA back, and TNA.
Oh, right. Yes, that's right. And they're really doing the full court press here. I mean, they're serious. In terms of like rebranding, relaunching their company.
And they're teasing some huge signing, and
Mhm.
this is also a story from earlier the year. All the WWE firings are going to be available any day now. Not that there were any huge names in there, so people have been trying to figure out who they're talking about, and they thought, could it be Dolph Ziggler? I wonder if it's not Sasha Banks. In terms of like a tease that would match the hype, and Trinity's over there.
Right.
Not necessarily maybe for like a long-term thing, but does she come in for, a half dozen matches, a few months?
And I
And they've
know
done that a lot in 2023, and I thought it was really successful, whether it was bringing in Will Ospreay for a few months, bringing in Nick Aldis for a couple months. I think it's a smart formula. They've helped get over their homegrown guys. I think maybe kind of like a buried story, but Impact or TNA had a really good year in 2023.
Yeah, and they also have at this point strong nostalgia on their side. They've been around for 20 years. You have people now who remember them like fully grown adults, remember them when they were little kids, that kind of thing. That's strong if you were into it as a kid, especially when they were at their biggest and hottest, like say, I don't know what, like 15 years ago.
Yeah.
The people that were watching then, there's a strong fondness. And I know this may not seem like the most important thing. I mean, I'm not, I've never been a big action figure guy with wrestling, but we just learned
Right.
this week they're getting back into the action figure business, which I don't think they have since maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, like 2015. I'm talking about like real action figures, not like,
Yeah.
bendables and buddies and things, but like actual, what we think of as wrestling figures they haven't done in like 8 years. You don't make moves like that if you're not serious about, okay, we're not going anywhere. We're growing our brand. We're going to, improve, and we're going somewhere. Like those are the kind of moves you make when you're doing that.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe in a little way, they're also benefiting from some of AEW's missteps in that if you're not a WWE fan and you're looking for an alternative, they can kind of raise their hand and say, we're still here, we're doing really good work, and
Mhm.
and in some ways, we're doing what AEW does as good or better in terms of some of the in-ring stuff. Because Impact's just been great. A real quick, just to touch on the other companies, Ring of Honor kind of a non-factor. This was the first full year of Ring of Honor under Tony Khan's management, and it's essentially been folded into
Yeah.
AEW. We just had what was supposed to be their biggest show of the year, Final Battle, and I used to go to Final Battle every year in New York, and it really was the culmination of like a year's worth of storylines, and was where you had the big marquee match. And there wasn't even, I think, was there a world title match? I mean, I think Eddie Kingston, I don't even know who the guy
No, it was a non-title match. I don't know what they're doing with that
yeah,
thing.
it
It's
just
just
it just sort of seems like, why are they keeping this thing around? I don't
I
get that.
think I think the biggest obstacle they had was when they didn't get it on a major platform. And I do not believe for a second that having it exclusive to Honor Club is what Tony Khan wanted. I don't believe
No.
that for a second because it's so limiting. It's like I didn't watch Final Battle, and
Yeah.
it's almost like people would complain about everything. So there was the complaint of like, well, And I agree with the complaint of you can't have the pay-per-views separate from Honor Club, because why would people get Honor Club? Because now you're asking for people to pay $10 a month for Honor Club and then have to purchase a pay-per-view, like 4 pay-per-views a year. So then they went and said, okay, yeah, we're going to fold the pay-per-view into Honor Club. And as a result of that, I wound up not watching it because I'm not an Honor Club subscriber. I don't feel it's worthwhile to pay this monthly thing, which is this, equivalent to the WWE network price. And you're getting only 4 pay-per-views a year. And the rest of it is you're getting this, quite frankly, forgettable weekly product that ROH puts out right now, which is how I feel about it. Losing TV distribution has really hurt them. And I think that the way the TV show is booked, it's like, look, I cover this show every week, and it's like, it's just a bunch of matches. It's just like 47 matches, over the course of 2 hours. It's like, it's a chore.
And it's been defined down by being, lower card fodder on AEW, right? So because those lines have been so blurred, those days of a Ring of Honor being its own thing and going to Final Battle or watching Ring of Honor on HDNet or what have you, like they were their own thing. And even though clearly they were several steps below the true big leagues, for Ring of Honor fans, that's as big as it got. But when you see that, like, Ring of Honor guys are, thrown into battle royals or lower card matches on AEW, then why would we get excited about a show that just features these guys? And the only way, like, they even get people excited about Ring of Honor events is by bringing in AEW guys, right? So
Right.
Final Battle had Blackpool Combat Club, and it's just kind of a mess now. It sort of reminds me of like when WWE briefly wanted to run WCW shows. Remember the Booker T Mark Bagwell disaster?
But you know what killed that? What killed their aspirations was they couldn't get TV. That's what killed it. They wanted WCW essentially to continue on the Turner Network. That was like their hope, was we're going to just keep running it. We'll run Nitro, we'll do the thing, except we own it now. And they were like, we just kicked that stuff off our network. We're not putting wrestling back on. And they had a very similar, they tried to shop it around, and they had done such a good job of making WCW seem second rate and worthless that's exactly what every media outlet thought. They were like, we don't want that. That's like, that's damaged goods. And so that's when they said, oh, we just have to make it a part of our show. We have to make it a part of Raw and SmackDown and the WWE product. And that's what sunk it and killed it. And they knew it. They knew it from the beginning. It was like a slow moving disaster. And that's what's happened with Ring of Honor, is that's how fans see it. If you watch that show every week, the problem is the talent roster is so shallow. It's just like musical chairs. It's like every week it's the same guys wrestling each other in different combinations. So many matches, but it just feels like we've seen this before a million times. It has very limited appeal, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know if they're doing it this thought. Are they still taping them at AEW tapings?
Yes.
Yeah, in front of like an empty crowd that's like
right.
not there
People are
for
exhausted.
it.
It's just right. They're not there for that. You're right.
No. It's just kind of a mess. And
it's like 205 Live, that's what.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, and it's a shame because we sort of never really got like more in Ring of Honor because they didn't quite die. They were there's been this sort of like zombie Ring of Honor.
Yes.
Yeah. For the last, whatever it is, 2 years. But it's like now sort of becoming evident that, like, yeah, those days are over. Ring of Honor, what it was for real, is just a memory now. They don't exist anymore. Last thing I think, because it's worth touching on international stuff. Not that I watch that closely. New Japan being sort of the big brand, it does. It felt like kind of an off year for them too. They kind of like rolled the dice with a Sonata as their world champion, but by every measure, he hasn't set the world on fire. Strange, because they still have Okada. They still have a lot of these guys who are top guys. Naito, Jay White, Will Ospreay, but for some reason they've hitched their wagon to Sonata, and I don't know who's excited about Sonata. Again, admittedly, I'm not the biggest fan. Maybe not the best commentator of this kind of thing. I guess the other thing that is potentially the biggest New Japan story of 2024 is what happens to Okada, right? I mean, there's a lot of discussion of his contract coming up and him potentially looking for a change. And there's been these little hints of WWE maybe courting him. Any thoughts on that? How big an acquisition would it be? Is the reality that most fans wouldn't even know? I mean, if
Right.
Okada comes in number 30 at the Royal Rumble, what's the reaction?
No, I think very minimal. I
Yeah,
think most fans, especially who watch that show, wouldn't know. That's part of the reason why I think he's more of a fit for AEW. I mean, it's almost laughable at this point, though, because it's like they have 40 million people over
yeah,
there. He'd get lost in the shuffle immediately, but it still feels like it's a product that where he'd be more welcome. I think he'd be in WWE. He'd be a minor factor. I mean, but again, stranger things have happened. I was amazed when they brought in Nakamura because I mean, Nakamura is similar to Okada, was
yeah.
considered one of the best in the world, but um, it was always questionable what his appeal would be in the United States. And while I think he hasn't had as much success here as he did there in terms of, I mean, I'm sure financially, but in terms of how he's seen as a star, I think that's more the company's fault than his. I think that they could have done a lot more with him when they first got him. So, I mean, that is to say that, yeah, he could wind up in WWE. I also recently saw, as recent as maybe yesterday, that I don't know if there is that much interest from WWE in him. It's almost like they feel like we're doing okay, like we're good right now.
Yeah.
We don't really need that. The upside is limited because that he could be another Kenta. I mean, look what happened with that.
Yeah.
I mean, that was supposed to be the biggest thing ever, and far from it. So that's
I
probably what they're thinking.
I love Okada. I think he's fantastic. I do think him outside of that setting, and we've even seen it in AEW. It's not the presentation isn't the same, right? I mean,
He
he
fell
works it,
flat. I mean, that was just like a big fart in church. I mean, sorry
right?
to
And
be
if that's in
vulgar, but
AEW, I mean, how would that go over in WWE? I mean, there's 11-year-old kids in the
mhm.
audience who got their little Cody Rhodes wrestling buddy. They have no idea who Okada is. That's the reality. But you touched on, I mean, doesn't mean they can't make it work. They can't tell the story of
Yeah.
how what a big deal he is, that he's the greatest
They
wrestler.
could remake him. I mean,
Yeah.
they've done it. They didn't know who Nakamura was either, and you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like,
And
they can
Okada
do that.
is 10 years younger than Nakamura, maybe something like that. So
Right.
um, um, I think if they're willing to put in the effort, it could be a worthwhile investment, and it could help cement WWE as the place where stars are. I mean, and you do look at that roster right now, kind of going full circle to how we started this conversation, and it is loaded. I mean, this is uh, WWE is filled with stars now. And
Mhm.
that wasn't the case for a long time. But they're also at the point where it's like, sure, we'll take another star. I would think. I mean, I'd love to see Okada over there. Imagine some of
Yeah.
imagine Okada and Cody Rhodes. You could have a lot of great matches. Okada and Seth Rollins. I don't really think it's going to happen. And there's also some of the issues with Will also go for Osprey in terms of having roots, having I don't know if he's got kids, but he's got a wife. And that's another thing that maybe is a better fit for AEW because it sounds like they're a little more flexible in terms of letting a guy stay there,
Right.
flying
And
when you
less
need.
responsibilities. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
you're needed less.
yeah, yeah. All right, Ryan. Anything you want to promote before we head out for the year?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, there's my podcast, Shut Up and Wrestle, as I've talked about on here, suawpod.com. My 100th episode is coming out the holiday week, the week between Christmas and New Year's. So maybe around the same time. And my guest is Jim Cornette.
Oh,
So
great.
that was a big get for me. I had to work for about a year to secure that. Thanks to Brian Last for making that happen. But it met every expectation. I recorded it. It was phenomenal. It was great. And that'll be out. And also, I want to mention too, because we were talking about women's wrestling and movies like The Iron Claw. There's a Mildred Burke movie that they're doing called Queen of the Ring, which comes out next year. And I was interviewed for a documentary that's going to go along with that movie on the women's wrestling of that era, Moolah and Mae Young and all that stuff. So that's an exciting project. It doesn't have a title yet, but that's a project I'm involved in that should be out by next summer. I'll be talking more about that.
Exciting. You're going to have an exciting 2024, and looking forward to it. Definitely looking forward to a new book, the Gorilla Monsoon book. Do you expect that to be out in 24?
Well, the manuscript is due in May. We'll see if I get there, if I make it in time, with things being how they are, having to juggle everything else in life with writing. But the research has been done for a while now. I'm up to chapter 4 out of 15 chapters in the book. But that's deceptive because I haven't even gotten to his pro wrestling career yet. So I mean, like the biggest chapters lay ahead. So I'm hoping if I hit that manuscript date in May, I think there's a chance that it comes out by the end of 2024. If I miss it, I think you're looking more at like an early 2025 book.
Okay, exciting stuff. Brian, thank you so much. Another year in the books. Always a pleasure working with you. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas to you, your family, and certainly all the listeners. We will see you in 2024. Before that, here's part 2 of my interview with former PWI writer and editor Bob Smith.
What was another thing I thought about? What was your favorite time in wrestling? I mean, when you whether it was built up to a certain show or a certain angle, but what to you during your time with the magazines was sort of the high point of your fandom?
At my time with the magazines, the high point of my fandom before I get to the magazines was 1980, the Zbyszko. Yes, that's before I got to the magazines. About 8 years before I got to the magazines, but that's a whole other ball of wax. It didn't cost me money. I bought a $1,000 VCR because I saw something coming, and I said I had to record this. But in any event, at my time in the magazines, any event you're saying, or any happenstance or any feud?
What was your favorite time to be working there? What was I even think like
1991, a year before I left, because I got to go to Memphis for a week.
Okay.
And I spent a week with Jerry Lawler.
Oh, that sounds fun.
And if I have to look back and choose a wonderful, exciting, revelatory insider week, that was it.
What was the access? Were you,
Oh, everybody knew who I was, and they greeted me with open arms. It was exciting to me because this was all Lawler's idea. I had called him. I was burnt out. I remember being burnt out to a crisp. And I said, I want to go on vacation, but I want to take a few days and I want to see wrestling. I want to go to Memphis. I've never been to Memphis.
Go on vacation to go watch wrestling.
I did. I wanted to get away from it all by myself. I did. So I called Jerry Lawler and I said, can I get a press pass for whatever shows you're running this particular week? And he goes, press pass? I'll put you on TV. Let's run an angle. So I did an angle where I was presenting him with a picture of him with his old manager Sam Bass and his old tag team partner. But here came Leatherface, who sawed the picture in half, the villain, right? And I ran off because it was scary, Yeah. But it was more than that. I got to talk wrestling psychology with Eric Embry. I got to talk the state of the business with Jerry Jarrett. I got to talk to Bill Dundee. I got to talk to Tony Anthony. I got to talk to Tojo Yamamoto and Robert Fuller and young Jeff Jarrett.
Yeah.
And Dave Brown. Lance Russell was in the NWA at that point. He'd already left. But I'll tell you what, for a wrestling, first of all, I loved the wrestling studio show from Memphis. It was fantastic, Channel 5. For me to stand on that program where every wrestler you could think of was part of, total career highlight for me. I loved Memphis studio wrestling. It still had that real feel to it. The fans were still really, really serious about it. And to me, nothing will ever top that. I thought it was just magic for me.
You were in New York at the time, and you were a New Yorker. So how were you even? Was it through the magazine that you got even exposed to Memphis wrestling?
We had that series of tape traders that we traded tapes with. We had a lady named Emmy Yates. A lady named Emmy Yates in Atlanta, Georgia. And I don't know who set this up. I'm sure it was after. Every weekend, she would. Joe Pedicino in Atlanta had a 6 to 8 hour wrestling block of all these different federations all in one show. Continental, Mario Savoldi, WWF, NWA, Smoky Mountain, on and on the list went, and Memphis. And she would tape it all, 1 8 hour VHS tape, and send it to us every week. We would send her the old tapes back. She'd send us another one, and I watched every frame of those shows. So I know everything about those shows because I watched them every single week. And not only that, I think Portland would send us tapes, Calgary would send us tapes, So I that's how I got to know Memphis. For the minute I saw that studio show, I said, "Oh God, this is great." I really thought that was the best wrestling studio show ever, because the first wrestling show I ever saw as a young kid at 12 years old was Championship Wrestling with Johnny Powers, which was Pedro Martinez's federation out of Cleveland and Buffalo, and it was a studio show. But this had the same flavor as that, and I just bang, that was it for me. Memphis was number one my whole period with the magazines. I covered them. I loved the whole vibe of it. That's gritty, old school Southern flavor, and that's what made it my favorite. And to this day, I think it's the best wrestling TV show I've ever seen.
So is it fair to say that outside of your work day at the magazines at the time, whatever it was, 9 to 5, 10 to 6, there was a lot of watching wrestling on your own time? I know you mentioned, again, you were kind of like the indie guy in the magazine. So was it going to shows on weekends, stuff like that?
Absolutely. All over the East Coast. Whatever there was a good indie looking card, or there was a match in Connecticut, I think it was, with Terry Funk versus Bob Backlund. I was there at ringside on my knees shooting photos. I went to a lot of indie. I was there for the formation of Tri-State and ECW and you name it. Bob Raskin and those other promoters would put on spot shows. I go to the spot shows with Mick Foley and stuff like that. Yeah. It was like, you're just bringing back a flood of memories. It's like, yeah, I was living it, man. I was 24/7 wrestling for about a good 5 years. There's no question about it.
I remember.
I really lived it, and I applied myself really hard. I would go to places sometimes to cover it, sometimes to just shoot photos. But and I shot photos at the Garden too. So I don't know what to say other than if there was a job involved in wrestling, I was there. Oh no, I never got paid extra. No,
that's kind of what I was getting.
No, I never got paid. I had a salary. I mean, I thought the salary was fair that I had, but no, if I went, I would get expenses.
Yeah,
but I wasn't getting paid extra.
Yeah,
I didn't care.
No, I know. I hear you. I mean, like,
I loved it, and I was. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how you feel about wrestling and covering it now in PWI, but I'll tell you what: if I had that door flung that wide open, I was going to walk through it and go places.
Yeah, same thing. And for me, and this is. There's very much like a mark quality to this, but to me, a lot of the compensation that I've gotten over whatever it's been, 16, 17 years with the magazines now, is that I get to go to wrestling, right? I mean, that's the best part of the job, is that I get to. I'm hoping to go SmackDown tomorrow night in Barclays, and that's the highlight of all this stuff. So I agree. How you mentioned Tri-State and it brought back memories. How disappointed were you when Buddy Rogers no-showed that event, because that was what they were building to, right? Was a Buddy Rogers.
Oh match. No, do you remember Buddy Rogers died,
and that's why they didn't do the match, right? Wasn't he? Right, that's why he no-showed, because he died. Is that right? Because I thought he no-showed for another reason and then he died. So they.
I'm a little fuzzy on it, but I know that. Yeah. I've always had it in my mind that he died. That's why the match didn't take place. But that's not exactly true. I think you're right. No, the real thing that happened was Goodhart went out of business. That's what happened.
That's right. Yes.
That's where we conflate it.
So they would have done the Buddy
and decided to just call it cold turkey and cancel the whole thing, including his league. That was over. So I always conflate in my mind the fact that Buddy died before the match.
I remember. Yeah, I mean,
that's a huge surprise.
ECW, that's where it was at.
That was the birth of ECW, was Tri-State. Yeah. Really, when you think about it, or at least it's Todd Gordon was a financial backer, so it was like that's what it was. But yeah, I was disappointed in that. I wanted to see that match too, even if it was 30 seconds. I wanted to see that match.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing I've talked with Brian about, because we lost some great ones this year in Superstar Billy Graham and Iron Sheik and Terry Funk, is that I kind of think about it, because I just heard today about a 99-year-old World War II veteran dying, and with every one of those, you think like you're closer and closer to that whole generation being gone. And I remember. When I started working in journalism, I think there was still the odd obituary here and there for World War One veterans, right? And
Mhm.
they were down to just like a handful, and obviously, I mean, I imagine they're all gone by now, and that's happening with the World War II veterans. And I sort of sometimes think about that with wrestling generations too. And you talked about, your favorite time being that angle in '80 with Zabisco, and I think about my late father and what he talked about being the best times in wrestling. And I remember him being a big Johnny Valentine fan. I remember him being a fan of Buddy Rogers. And now again, when you talk to fans even my age or older, and they get nostalgic and they talk about the good old days, they talk about the late '90s, and now sometimes these days they talk about the 2000s, and there's even now some nostalgia for the 2010s. So when you go back, certainly pre-rock and wrestling to that '70s era, there are so few fans even left from that era. Is that sort of bittersweet to you that this is, and one place you see it is like when WWE does any kind of a look back, or like the Hall of Fame. These are names that never even come up anymore, as far as their contributions,
You make a really good point, and yes, I think I get a little bit. It goes from nostalgia to a sense of loss, because I have a really good steel trap mind. I don't know, maybe because I don't drink or never did drugs or something like that, but I just turned. I'm going to say this out loud. I just turned 65 in October. Okay.
Okay.
I'm as active as I've ever been, and I still can think, and I can still remember a lot of stuff. I'm thankful for the memory that I have, which is really good. And I just had last week, I interviewed Paige Von Hess Sutherland. Kurt Von Hess in the National Wrestling Federation in 1970 was the first wrestler who ever scared me watching TV as a little 12-year-old. So I got to talk to her and exchange. And I think she was excited talking to me because I actually remembered her dad. It wasn't just a name. You know what I'm saying? I knew his stardom. I knew who his tag team championship partner was. It was Eric the Red. I remember where he worked. I remember he did this. I remember he did that. When you think of it, 1970 is a long time ago now. And to have memories of 70, 71, 72, 73 in my head, I'm thankful for it. But by the same token, I'm turning around, I'm realizing nobody else has those memories. It's daunting. I know a man who lived to 101 years old, which is a great gift. But one of the parts of that gift is your contemporaries aren't there anymore.
Right.
Once you reach that age, even when you're in your 80s, they start to go away, or 70s even. So, it's bittersweet. I'm glad I have a good memory, and I'm glad there are some people around. I mean, but when I mentioned Kurt Von Hess, do you know who that is?
It's not a name that I've heard
Right.
the name, but I couldn't pick him out of a lineup.
Right, exactly. You see what I'm saying? To me, he was a huge star because he's the first villain I ever saw. But find me 6 more people who know this. You know what I'm saying? It's
Yeah,
like,
and the bigger shame of it, there's just a reality that there are going to be fans that grow up and grow old and won't be around for that. But I think like the bigger shame is that they're sort of lost in history, and I don't know that promoters, and by promoters, we're really talking WWE and Vince McMahon, don't acknowledge that much. Whenever there's a discussion, a countdown of the top 10 greatest of this or the top 10 greatest out, or what the Mount Rushmore is, it feels like they start at Hulk Hogan, right? They start at the mid 80s, and there's not even a consideration for a Mount Rushmore that would have a Bruno Sammartino in it, or a Buddy Rogers, or what have you. And I don't even know. I mean, I think among most fans, it's not, malicious or anything. They just don't know it. They don't remember it. But if Vince McMahon does, but you wouldn't know it from the TV product.
Well, here's the thing. It hit me really hard this year when Jerry Jarrett died, the former promoter in Memphis, influential guy. Every time we lose somebody like that, we've lost a lot of guys like that this year. Superstar Graham, Terry Funk. These are the guy who knew the psychology of wrestling going back all the way to the 1960s. Okay. Right. And every time we lose one of these fellows or women, we lose a little piece of that history, and we lose the lineage, and we lose the opportunity to educate young fans and young wrestlers and young promoters about what makes an effective heel, face, feud, TV show, organization. It goes right down the line. That's what bothers me. I one of the reasons I started my silly little podcast, the Outdated Wrestling Hour, is because I don't want people to forget these things and these people. And conversely, I want them maybe to learn about bits of wrestling psychology they never considered. Like, I don't like your wrestling you used to watch. It's just squash matches. Who wants to see that? Well, there was a psychology to the squash matches. They weren't just a big guy beating up a little guy. They were working their way to a title opportunity. You see what I'm saying? TV wrestling had a theme to it. You were beating these unheralded young wrestlers in an advance to get title shots up the road. Wins and losses used to mean something. Now a guy approaches the ring and goes, "I don't like you. Get a referee." Right? Right? Basically, So again, there's a psychology about everything that went on. It wasn't just a squash match. Blood wasn't just to show gore. Blood when used judiciously could rise a crowd into a fever pitch because they were really upset that their favorite wrestler just got busted open. Yeah. Now it's almost like a polite greeting. Bang, you know what I'm saying? So I want people to remember the stars of yesterday, the federations of yesterday, because that's how we got here now. You know what I'm saying? And it's all part of the lineage. And the thing about wrestling is, and the WWF on their televisions has traditionally, going back to the 70s, done a horrible job talking about the past. They never do. Have you ever noticed that? They rarely do. And they rarely do unless it ties into something that's going on now.
Right. Again, I feel like, and I think that, what that point is moves, but for a long time, it's like wrestling didn't exist before Hulk Hogan. And then I think we moved past that, and now there's even kind of very little mention of that 80s era, and now the nostalgia, not even the 90s, and now you see like all this kind of romanticizing of what do they call it, the ruthless aggression era, which is like early 2000s. That stuff was bad. Right. I mean, that was a bad time, and wrestling business was down, and the creative was really bad. But there's a generation of fans that are now in their 30s or 40s that look back fondly on that because that's what they grew up on, and that's always going to be the case. And that's why I do think it's important, again, as much as you could be nostalgic, to try to kind of look objectively at wrestling and what is good and what is not so good at any given point. Have you checked out Billy Corgan's NWA at all? For a while there, they were on the nostalgia.
Yeah, I go back, and then I go back to when they did Power on YouTube in 2000 or before 2000, and I was rooting for that. I thought they had a great lineup. LA Knight, Thunder Rosa. Just go down the line. You had guys that weren't on a national stage much, like Nick Aldis and Tim Storm, and they looked great. And Camille was fantastic, and a bunch of them. And then the pandemic took the wind out of their sails for a better part of a year. And when they came back, it just wasn't the same. Yeah. What they're doing now, I have no earthly idea what they're trying to do with this
Tyrus route, whatever, a year plus with Tyrus, the belt on Tyrus, because he was on Fox News, and I think Corgan will deny that that's what it was about, but I kind of wouldn't buy it. And I get it from the standpoint of, like, the guy's got millions of viewers on TV every day. Do something with that. But they never got back to that. And, I don't know how successful. I mean, I think for nostalgia buffs, it was a blast. There was a while there in 2019, 2020, where it was my favorite thing to watch every week.
And me too.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
And it was a lot of,
I just,
they did the throwback stuff, and also weaved in kind of current stuff really well. I mean, even things like the way they worked in the Rock and Roll Express and Jim Cornette. I know he got in trouble over there, but it was, I thought it was a really good balance. And actually, I think, it's become clear that maybe that wasn't that much to do with Billy Corgan as much as it was some other people who aren't there anymore.
Maybe that's true. All I know is I'm vastly disappointed. I mean, look, I still look at it when I have an opportunity to see it, any aspect of it. But they ran this cocaine angle, which made no sense, and at the pay-per-view, and which was I did I hear right that got something like 200 buys nationally?
I don't know. Can I believe it? Sure. Yeah. There's the talk that they're
Yeah, I mean,
talking with CW.
so the talk of the cocaine angle got far more press than anything that the wrestlers did. And there's you got a problem when that's the case, right? I'll leave it at that. I mean, they're so unfocused. It's just unfocused. And they have a lot of people. If you want to get on a national stage, I hate to say it, they don't have enough people there that deserve to be on it. I hate to say that, but it's true.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I do think it's tricky in that there are like the indie darlings that people talk about, and the reality is that like the best of them are going to get to a certain level, and then they're going to get snapped up by the AEWs of the world or what have you, and so you're kind of, you're in this sort of complicated situation where you want your guys, you want to find indie talent that is worth putting on television and showcasing, but if they're that good, they're going to be taken away. So I actually think Impact does a really good job. Now back to TNA, of identifying these people that weren't necessarily on the radar of an AEW or a WWE, but have something going for them, and they find these guys, and they'll treat them like stars. This is the new Impact, the post Dixie Carter Impact, whether it's people like Ace Austin or Chris Bay, which were names that when I first saw them on Impact, and they treated them like stars right away, and were telling us these people are a big deal, even when the reality was relatively few people knew them. So I think Impact's actually done a terrific job there. One thing, we're getting to the hour mark here. Another thing that I thought of looking at these magazines that I never noticed before was that, at least for a period here, outside of your columns, and you'd have a column, and Bill would have a column, and other writers, the feature stories, in the magazines didn't have bylines on them. So
wait a minute, hold the phone. Yeah, they did.
Not a lot of these didn't. As
really?
far as I can tell.
Yeah. I know that. Late 70s, early 80s, they didn't use them, but I think with the advent of PWI, they started putting byline. I always got a byline, and so did everybody else. I'm confused as to what you're looking at.
All right, so I'm just randomly opening.
What's the issue?
This is December 88 Inside Wrestling. So this was probably around August you were putting this together.
Right.
Continental Catfight, Bambi and Lady Mystic's Dirty White War.
That's a good headline. Oh, I love it.
And I just went through the whole thing, and there's not a name on it.
But how about the feature? How about the articles, though? There was no bylines? Really?
It depends on them. But I mean, look, so here's that is a feature, and there's no byline on it. And some others wouldn't either. Here's another one: The Powers of Pain, who they are and why you can't trust them. And there is no byline on it.
I don't recall this.
Complain now. Let's reach out to Stu and give him hell for this.
Yeah, he's got enough problems as it is.
And it's a lot of them. And I wonder what that was about. Well, so I was going to ask you what your thoughts were on it, and
I don't recall it. I always recall getting bylines for my writing, and I shouldn't tell this out of tail story. I remember writing whole issues and sprinkling other people's names on the articles. Really, seriously. Yeah. When we got really busy, I would mix up the writer names, and it didn't really mean anything to any of us. So, Andy Rodriguez wrote this. Bill Apter wrote that. But I wrote it.
I was going to ask you about Matt Brock and
Matt Brock,
and
Matt Brock is alive and well, and is on the podcast that's out right now.
Is that right? Yeah, he wrote something for the recent PWI. Yes. But it is, and now acknowledging that you've written under other people's names.
Yeah,
I even found some stories in here written under wrestlers' bylines. There's a story that I found that Sting wrote, and obviously all the interviews and stuff used to be done that way. So how much work or how seriously would you try to capture somebody else's voice when you'd be doing something like that?
Mick Foley gave me the greatest compliment about my writing that any wrestler ever gave me. He said, "You really capture my voice."
Yeah.
Because I'd hung with him, I'd seen him in the Indies, and I kind of knew who he was and what he was about. He goes, I said, "This reads like I said this." That was the greatest compliment you could have given me. Because let's face it, we were kayfabe writing all left and right. I love being Matt Brock for a while. I don't know about Liz Hunter. For some reason, I never got involved with Liz Hunter. I don't know what Liz Hunter was all about. I don't think she was much in the magazines when I was there, but she was, so I can't say she wasn't.
I think she contributed to the most recent women's 250 list.
Did she really? That's awesome. Yeah. That's great to hear she's still out plying her trade. That's great. No, listen, I don't know how you feel, Al. I loved my job. I just, you say we're wrapping up. I just want the world to know that I was the luckiest son of a gun from Catskill, New York, coming down to the big city and joining a national magazine company like that, which led to I was in publishing until April 2021. I mean, all that time I was in magazines and periodicals, and I even worked with books for a while. That job kept me going. What I learned at PWI and the newspapers that I worked at before that just kept me going all those decades. So it was a magical time. Like I said, the only really bad day I ever had was when Stanley Weston walked in and goes, "I'm selling the Nick Karabots and Kappa Publishing in Pennsylvania. There's a job waiting for you if you want it." And I wanted it, but I couldn't go. Isn't that terrible? It's just terrible. Yeah, but you know what? If that's the worst thing that ever happens to me, I made up pretty lucky. So, it's all worked out. I kept writing, I worked for WCW for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Their magazine with Colin Bowman was the editor. And I worked with Sandy Krebs at Wrestling's Main Event and for Apter at WOW.
Mm-hmm.
So, I kept going until I got burnt out, At one point I did get burnt out and I just said, that's enough.
I'm not there yet.
No, but here's the thing. You know what? I needed the respite because when I came back, when I did the Arizzi podcast in 2021 and the one that I started this year, bam, I'm back. It's like the thing that amazes me, and you're going to find this out too, Al. People are going to remember you years from now, decades from now, over the work you've done recently. You will find it phenomenal. Don't do what I did and put it in a sock drawer. Keep it going because you know what? People value what you do. They love PWI. Just wear that badge of honor with pride. Don't walk away from it like I did because it's like you will find out decades later how much it meant to people.
Yeah, I actually a little anecdote from earlier this week, and it was a pretty hectic week in my day job this week. In there somewhere, I took the time to interview Tony Khan because they've got a show coming to Long Island, and I work in the media in Long Island, and they were looking to promote. So I talked to Tony Khan, and they were talking to me in my capacity working my day job, and I mentioned to him, I'm also Al Castle for Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and this meant so much more to him than my other job. And it's fascinating that that resonates. It's like, oh, like that's a thing to some people, and it is, and that's great,
Well, I understood it at the time. Like I'd be at Madison Square Garden covering a show, and I was not supposed to be there because we were kicked out by the WWF. But people knew who I was, and they would approach me for autographs at the Garden. What is Bob Smith? Doughy Bob Smith doing signing autographs at Madison Square Garden.
Because, it wasn't like there was an internet or podcast or YouTube or even your face in the magazine.
No, I'll tell you what, the Vladimirs of the world and the super fans knew who you were when you walked in. They would spot you at 20 paces. Mm-hmm. But the fact that people remember this stuff all these decades later is the biggest shock I've ever had in my life. And I'm so grateful for it.
Sure.
Because like I said, when I sit here talking to you, I'm your age.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't aged all these years. It's bringing back a conversation like this, brings back these memories that are so good and so vivid. And I like to have an interview from someone like you because you shook my memory a little bit on a couple of these things. You did a nice job helping me remember stuff. You see what I mean? It's only when someone else brings it up that you can really push it out of you, remember little facts and figures. And it's amazing to have that opportunity to still talk about this stuff all these years later.
No, and I love talking to guys like you and going, again, preparing for this. I wanted to find our original conversation. So I was scrolling through all the PWI podcasts, and again, there have been 227 of them, and it had been so many years since I even thought of some of these episodes. And I'm like, I interviewed this guy, and it really is, I pat myself on the back, a who's who of like wrestling names that we've had here on the podcast. By far, my favorite are talking to you or Craig Peters or Bill or George Napolitano, all the people. You mentioned who was the old art director for PWI.
Oh, Ken Morgan.
Yeah, we had Ken, and he was so great. I remember, one of the.
Wait, well, hold the phone. You had Ken Morgan on?
We had Ken Morgan on, and one of my favorite anecdotes that he gave
found
me was,
him. Oh my gosh!
He told me about him, freehand drawing the PWI logo, and he said if you look at those early magazines where it used to be in a frame, so you had the PWI a logo at top, and then the main photo would be kind of in a frame. That if you see it closely, the line is very imperfect. It's not perfectly straight because he freehand drew that, and that's just so fascinating to me. Stuff like that. So
we talked about it. I had Craig Peters on early in the podcast, and the first thing I did was give a tip of the hat to Ken Morgan, because he was as big a factor as any of the writers were in the success of those magazines. You would hand him an article with some photos and a headline and some captions, and he would nail it every time. You didn't have to think about it. It was the right vibe, the right font, the right feature, the right color. He was a genius.
Hulk Hogan's head.
You have to make you look at those covers, just the use of certain fonts, the use of headlines, and you didn't even have to think about it. You just handed it off to the art department. They would come up with the great work that they did. So I've always extolling his virtues because he was as big a part of the success as anybody else was there. Ken Morgan and his whole team there. Unbelievable.
Yeah. And if I could transform this into a plug, we are still doing great work. And honestly, I don't say that, but I just got the latest issue in the mail, and I love this cover. Fantastic. And actually, for the first time in years, visited with PWI folks a few weeks ago. I drove down to the mothership in Bluebell and sat down with our art director, Laura, now, and still doing great work. So as much as like I love nostalgia, like one of the cool things also is to remind people, yes, we're still at it. So and that's a really cool thing, right? That this magazine that's got its lineage back to the 70s or even, I mean, I know one of the coolest things I got to do was interview Stu, Craig, and Bill on the 40th anniversary of PWI a few years ago. And now that was 4 years ago, something like that. So it's crazy. We're still going.
It's funny how things are coming full circle. I just got together with Craig Peters in Manhattan. We saw a Broadway show together. I haven't been in the same room with him probably at that point about 20 years.
Wow.
So doing this silly little podcast that I do has been so healthy because I saw Bill twice in this interim since I started this year. So it's just been exactly what I needed. It helps you get back in touch with my old compadres, and I get to talk to people like you who are carrying on the tradition, my friend, and you're doing a great job. And I plucked my $9.99 down. I'll have the other day to buy my copy of PWI. So
excellent.
Right Aid, my friend, Right Aid. I was just happy to see a newsstand anywhere,
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm happy to see a newsstand anywhere.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, there's still the Hudson Newses of the world, and you still, whenever I'm in my local King Cullen supermarket, I find a PWI. I'll always open it to my column, and I will leave it open on the stand for everyone.
Oh, you know what though? I impressed somebody once when I was with London, and dig this.
I think you told me this story.
I had just left full time, and I was working for another magazine company, freelancing for a third one. And I walked into a Hudson News. And I said, "Ed, watch this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think I counted 17 national magazines where my name was included."
That's great.
All
Yeah,
the
it is.
same day
Yeah.
at Hudson News. Am I that prolific anymore? Nah.
Of
I had
course, you
more
got
freelance than I knew what to do
filthy
with.
rich doing all that, right?
Oh yeah,
You
sure.
as I
Nobody that freelances gets filthy rich. But I will say this: some things are more important than money, my friend.
No, I agree.
I'm
That's what I try to
I'm sure you take a great sense of pride in what you're doing, right? And you should, because you're
my
carrying on that
kids
tradition.
see
My
me
friend.
hustling and they think, like I'm never doing that, and maybe they can't have the most expensive shoes or the fanciest vacation, but you try to. One of my editors in my other job, I remember telling me something that last, and he said, "We get paid in fun." And it's sort of true. And now that I'm kind of getting older in this business, I think I'm and not just the wrestling stuff, but my day job, I'm appreciating more and realizing that this stuff is fun. Today,
Yeah.
I was about to visit someone in a hospital this morning. At parking my car, when I get a call, I got to jump on a train, get to Manhattan for a press conference. And it was, where's the nearest train station? Got to find parking, jump on a train, get over there, sit for the press conference, quickly file a story, jump on a train, get back, finally do that hospital visit, whatever, 5 hours later. And it's exhausting, and it's also sort of invigorating, and that's what we do.
Well, I'll tell you what, you guys can't see me, but I'm rubbing my hands together because you know what, guys? I'm going to do a commercial here. Al Castle is going to come on my podcast. I'm going to grill you about the day in the life of a current PWI staffer. And I need the truth. The public needs to know what it's like to work for PWI today.
And it's a little different than even, ironically, until not too long ago, it wasn't that different because we both worked for the same guy in Stu Sachs. But yeah, there's a new sheriff in town, and Kevin McElvaney. I know how well you know Kevin.
I actually, something, I was doing a blog a few years ago, and I needed a picture of Baron Mikhail Cicluna. So I called the office. I said, could I buy the rights to use one, on one time? Yeah. So he helped me set up the rights for it wasn't even all that expensive. And we took a liking to each other. And I think this is how you and I are talking right now, because I was talking to Kevin recently. So, no, Kevin's doing a fantastic job. I think they picked the right guy, don't you?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and it was, we've talked about wrestling evolving, and I think that also has gone with the magazine. And I think Kevin makes sense in that evolution. When you think of that graphic of the gorilla that turns into the upright man,
right.
Kevin is somewhere in the middle of there.
Oh my gosh.
An important cog, in kind of like graduating to where we are now. And I do think, there were so many things, and we could talk about it more in your podcast, but there were so many things that were just like, steeped in tradition in PWA for so long, and like the world title thing, right? Like, and Stu was a big stickler, like, no, there could only be whatever it was. At some point, there was one world title, and it was such an exclusive club. And then when Kevin came in, he kind of blew all that up, And I remember, me having come up, working under Stu for whatever it was, 15 years at the time. It was sacrilege. It was like, what? We can't have
my era, we had three. You know who they were, right?
AWA, NWA, WWF. Yeah.
Even though, the end of the AWA era was sad and pitiful to watch them fade away, but they were still a world championship. Larry Zbyszko was the last champion. So
and that's how I came up, was like that. Those were the real world titles. So even when I remember when ECW got world title status, as a fan at the time, being kind of uneasy about it, I was like, really? Especially when, like, I remember this was always like my cutoff point, was when Steve Carino became world champion, and thinking, Steve Carino's no world champion. No, all due respect. Well, I just saw a signing autographs near here, but I remember thinking, like, come on, like, we got to draw the line somewhere. But Kevin took a different take on all of that, and now it's kind of wide open.
Now, if there's one thing that's wrong with today's wrestling, I'll use my old man voice. If there's anything that's wrong with today's wrestling, there's too many belts.
Yes.
You have guys who only work one VFW hall every 6 months who have world championship belts now. Come on, guys. Please Call yourself an organizational champion, sure, but don't say world. Who are you fooling? You know what I'm saying? It's ridiculous. Go on Facebook and look around. It's like everybody's got a belt.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
I think all those guys work more than Roman Reigns does.
Yeah. Well, that's true too. That's a good point. That's a great point.
Yeah, who's wrestled like a half a dozen times in the last year. Anyway, we're close to the hour and a half mark, and I could do it all night.
Yeah, it's fun.
But we will continue. That's a fun part. We'll be able to continue this conversation in a couple of weeks.
Yes, this is part one, and please give my regards to Brian, who I have the utmost regard for, and for Kevin and everybody there. I am still all of your biggest fan, even though I'm 106 years old. So thank you very much for that.
And before we wrap up, we'll tell people where they can find your podcast.
Oh, everywhere. We even 3 weeks ago we made our debut on YouTube, regular video YouTube. You get to see my ugly face for. I do the same thing Cornette does, only I don't have a funny cartoon. I just use our broadcast placard. It says the Outdated Wrestling Hour, all new, all old. So that's me right next to it, and it's doing fine. I just figured I had the opportunity to put it on YouTube, so I did. And we'll see if anybody watches it that way, because you'd still listen to it. I have no interest in doing an audio or video podcast, but in any event, it's at every single podcast application I can think of. If there's any I'm missing, I don't know what they are. We're even on like Samsung News and Odyssey, and which is a CBS run thing, and all this other stuff. It's we're everywhere. Not hard to find. If you want to find me, come to Facebook. I'm Bob Smith, and you see me singing with BB King on the lead page, because that's one of the reasons I left the wrestling magazines. I became a blues singer for 15 years and got on the road. But one of my great moments is I got to perform with BB King 10 times, and you can see it for real on my Facebook page.
Wow, what a thrill. Excellent. Bob, this was such a pleasure. I can continue doing this and looking forward to doing that in a couple of weeks.
Yes, in a couple of weeks, we were going to talk again. And again, just thank you for having me on, and thank you for carrying on the tradition, man. It's important.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you.